Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right if I'm talking from right here? Do we have any? Awesome. Thank you. Wonderful. So my name is Melissa Gregory. I am the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters here at the University of Toledo. And I would like to welcome you to the Philip Markowicz Annual Lecture in Judaism and Jewish Biblical Studies, which is supported by the Markowicz family and the Jewish Federation and Foundation of Greater Toledo. Sorry, let me just get this centered. To those of you who are here in the Center for the Performing Arts with us tonight, thank you so much for being a part of our live audience. And to those of you who are joining us online, thank you for participating in our live stream. My thanks also to the Department of Music for providing this space for us tonight, and to the Department of Communication for providing our online viewers with live access. So my job tonight is to introduce our main speaker, Dr. Barry Jackisch, who is the 2023-24 Philip Markowicz Endowed Professor in Judaism and Jewish Biblical Studies. The Markowicz Endowed Professorship is named after Philip Markowicz, and before I introduce Dr. Jackisch, I just need to pause here and share with you a little bit about Philip Markowicz, who is a very extraordinary individual, and tell you a little about why this professorship is named for him. Philip Markowicz was born the son of a rabbi in Poland in 1924. From all accounts, he was a Talmud prodigy, but his yeshiva education was interrupted when the Nazis invaded Poland. Philip survived the dark and violent times that followed this invasion. He survived the ghetto of Łódź. He survived several concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and he survived a death march. With the exception of his brother, the rest of Philip's family was murdered by the Nazis. After being liberated by the Allies, Philip met and married his wife, Ruth, in a displaced persons camp where they started their family. This young couple, their family, emigrated to Toledo, where, with absolutely no connections or resources, Philip trained himself in electronics and created a thriving business. Over his lifetime, Philip continued his passion for Torah study and wrote extensively during his retirement. He published a well-received autobiography, My 3 Lives, which, if you are interested in this, it's been published by the University of Toledo Press, and it is, in fact, for sale out in the lobby. A representative from the University of Toledo Press is there. And shortly before his passing in 2017, he completed the manuscript for Losing God in Translation, which is also available. Philip's children, Dr. Alan Markowitz and Professor Sylvia Markowitz Neal, together with their spouses, Hinda Markowitz and Daniel Fischel, have supported the Markowicz Endowed Professorship at the University of Toledo for the past 2 decades. We are grateful for their support and also for the support we have received from the Jewish Federation and Foundation of Greater Toledo for this lecture. And now to our speaker. Dr. Barry Jackisch, the current Markowicz Endowed Professor, received his PhD in history from the State University of New York at Buffalo and currently works as an associate professor of history here at the University of Toledo. Dr. Jackisch is also the current director of the university's Roger Ray Institute for the Humanities, so if you've seen any of those public events, that was under Dr. Jackisch's excellent leadership for that institute. Dr. Jackisch's research interests center on various aspects of modern Germany, fascism, and the Holocaust. He has written 1 book and multiple articles on these subjects. At the University of Toledo, he teaches courses in modern German and Russian history, the history of the Holocaust and comparative genocide, war and revolution in Europe, film and World War II, and the contemporary world. Dr. Jackisch's talk tonight is entitled Teaching with Tolerance in a Time of Hate, Jewish Private Schools in Nazi Berlin, 1933 to 1939. Please please join me in welcoming Dr. Barry Jackisch.
Well, thanks very much, Dean Gregory. I appreciate that introduction, and I will say it's great to see everyone here. I see many people that I know, some of you that I don't, but in any case, I see a lot of members of the community. I see students, I see friends, I see family. I see a lot of people that that mean a lot, and for all of you to be here, I think is a really important sign, not only of your interest in my talk, but in a bigger sense, your appreciation for this topic, I think, as well. So I'd like to start tonight by thanking, as did Dean Gregory, the Markowicz family, for making this event possible. Their generosity is a true example, testimony to the namesake of this sponsorship, Philip Markowicz, and his remarkable life and accomplishments as a devoted family man, religious scholar, successful local business person, and Holocaust survivor. My thanks also go to the Jewish Federation and Foundation of Greater Toledo and the University of Toledo College of Arts and Letters and Dean Melissa Gregory. The title of tonight's talk might come as a bit of a surprise. The simple fact that explicitly Jewish private schools were able to exist at all in Nazi Germany, and the fact that they survived as long as they did, might seem remarkable. As the following presentation hopes to make clear, studying these schools is important in its own right to remember those individuals, teachers, administrators, students, family members, who suffered Nazi persecution and still fought to create a space of honor, dignity, and learning in very difficult circumstances. But this particular subject also offers us some very valuable insight into the nature and history of the Holocaust as a whole, and a broader perspective on the terrible toll of hate and intolerance in modern societies. My talk tonight consists of 4 major parts. I think it's always a good idea for speakers to tell you what you're in for in advance, okay? My talk tonight begins with a very, very brief overview of the German school system itself before and after the Nazis. I then move to a brief survey of Berlin's Jewish life, a very rich story, before turning to the private schools themselves. And that part of my talk will feature a number of photos and a short, about 3-minute video on the PowerPoint that you'll see here behind me, and my concluding remarks. So let's start with the German educational system. Education was one of Nazism's early areas of focus, as party functionaries sought not only to shape content and pedagogy to fit their twisted ideology, but also to attack and eventually purge Jewish students, teachers, and administrators. Understanding what this system looked like both before and after 1933, the year the Nazis came to power, is an important first step in our attempt to understand this topic's broader importance. Following Germany's defeat in World War I, the country ratified a new constitution in August 1919, which also partly restructured Germany's educational system. While the individual states still administered the day-to-day budgets, curriculum, and other matters as they had done before the war, several new standards now applied throughout the country. The Weimar Constitution codified a number of basic educational rights, including equal access to education, equality between male and female students, and free education for the first 8 years of schooling. It also advocated compulsory attendance for the first 4 years of elementary school and entrance to a variety of different types of secondary schools based on merit and educational goals. Another key factor in the post-World War I era was religious instruction. Article 149 of the Weimar Constitution enshrined confessional religious instruction in schools according to the standards of the local religious communities in cooperation with state authorities. This article was tied to a much longer and complex running battle about confessional education and its place in a largely Christian Germany, divided primarily between Lutherans and Catholics. In effect, Weimar Germany's laws compromised on religious education by continuing to mandate it, but allowing greater flexibility in its implementation and curriculum. For Jewish students, this meant that they also could receive religious instruction in public schools from a Jewish teacher. Furthermore, Article 147 of the Constitution also allowed for the creation and maintenance of private schools as long as the educational standards and training met or exceeded state standards. This led to a small number of private, community-funded Jewish schools throughout Germany already before 1933. When the Nazis came to power in January of 1933, they sought to solve what they ominously referred to as the so-called Jewish question, including in the realm of education. In April 1933, the Hitler government passed what was called the Law Against the Overcrowding of German Schools, which limited the percentage of Jewish students allowed in any public school to no more than 1.5% of the total population of that school. As was the case with other Nazi anti-Semitic policies, the regime initially sometimes made exceptions. For example, children of war veterans, or of so-called mixed marriages between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, which in effect kept thousands of Jewish children in public school classrooms during the first couple of years of the Third Reich. As a result, they faced increasing harassment, intolerance, and savage bullying from their fellow classmates, and were subjected to the growing implementation of so-called racial instruction in the new Nazi-style curriculum. Many accounts exist of young Jewish children returning home in tears, unable to comprehend why they had been excluded from special school activities, or why many of their classmates had turned on them suddenly. In one heartbreaking case, a young Jewish girl recalled being excited about a Mother's Day celebration at school, only to be told that she could not sing along with her classmates or participate. When she and several other Jewish students specifically asked to be included, the teacher replied, quote, "I know you have a mother, but she is only a Jewish mother," unquote. In countless other cases, Jewish parents were caught in a terrible bind when their children asked for help with their homework that required them to write essays praising Hitler as a German savior and highlighting the importance of racial purity in German society. These daily insults and indignities would only grow more intense as the Nazi regime increased both legal and de facto persecution of Germany's Jews throughout the 1930s. All of this led to a reevaluation on the part of Germany's Jewish community about how best to proceed in this radically altered environment. Some were able to emigrate. We'll talk a bit more about that later. But for those families who chose to stay in Germany or could not leave, it became clear that the current Nazi educational system made their children's everyday lives increasingly intolerable. At the same time, Germany's Jewish community generally placed a very high value on education, so other alternatives had to be found. As a result, Jewish families had to adjust very quickly to find new ways to educate their children in the face of intensifying intolerance and hate. We will now turn to the example of Germany's capital city, Berlin, to examine this issue in more detail. A brief survey of Berlin's rich Jewish history is, therefore, in order. Berlin's Jewish history is nearly as old as the city itself, with the first documented reference coming in 1295 in a directive forbidding the city's weavers from buying yarn from Jewish merchants. In one short document, we can therefore confirm that Jews already lived in Germany's future capital city, and also that some of the deep prejudices that led to their persecution were already present in the 13th century. By 1575, the city's Jews had faced disease, deprivation, and multiple pogroms, culminating in their total expulsion by 1580. It would be nearly a century before they would return and establish a successful and growing community. This occurred in 1671, when the Prussian king Friedrich Wilhelm I invited 50 Jewish families to the city after they had been driven out of Vienna. By 1750, that number had expanded to almost 180 families, and it would continue to grow from there. In spite of this, Jewish existence in Berlin until well into the 19th century was severely limited by a range of discriminatory laws and regulations which kept Jews in a decidedly second-class status, denying them full citizenship in spite of their substantial contributions to the political, economic, and cultural growth of the Prussian state. This began to change in the so-called emancipation period in the mid-19th century. Even before this, in the Enlightenment era of the 18th and early 19th century, a vibrant Jewish cultural and religious scene had become well established in Berlin. Alongside this development came a growing debate about the status of Jews in Berlin and throughout the Kingdom of Prussia. At the core of this debate was a basic question. Could Jews become full citizens to be known simply as Germans of the Jewish faith? By the Revolutionary era of 1848 and after, this question was answered, at least legally, in the affirmative. The new Prussian Constitution of 1850 declared citizenship regardless of religion for all Prussians, and the Constitution of the newly unified German nation in 1871 affirmed the status of Jews in Germany as citizens. While legally binding, this hardly ended other forms of lingering discrimination and in fact unleashed new forces of hate. The Weimar era after 1918 witnessed the emergence of a deeply contradictory future for Berlin's Jewish residents. On the one hand, the collapse of the monarchy and legal changes removed nearly all remaining professional restrictions on Jews. Many Jewish leaders embraced the new democratic system and the increasing shift toward greater openness and tolerance to become a key part of the city's bourgeois liberal milieu. On the other hand, German Jews now faced an even more insidious anti-Semitic political movement that sought to blame all Jews for Germany's loss in World War I through the so-called stab-in-the-back myth. These right-wing extremists tried to blame Jews and others for betraying Germany's soldiers on the battlefield by allegedly undermining support for the war on the home front. When the Weimar economy faced extreme hyperinflation in the fall of 1923 and the catastrophic effects of the Great Depression beginning in 1929, Jews again bore the brunt of radical nationalist blame for the nation's ills. As German politics unraveled after 1929, a reorganized Nazi party under Adolf Hitler rocketed to substantial national popularity. By January 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, or head of the German government. Hitler and his Nazi allies then moved very quickly to eliminate basic civil rights and completely destroy Germany's democratic system. Throughout this process, the Nazis continually emphasized the so-called, quote-unquote, Jewish question, a vague and malleable attack on the country's small Jewish minority. The key concept underlying Nazi anti-Semitism was this: Jews were fundamentally racially different and could not be a long-term part of German society in any capacity. While it was not clear in January 1933 exactly how the Nazis would deal with Germany's Jews, it was clear they were a primary target. One of the first areas the Nazis chose to act out their hate-filled rhetoric came in the realm of youth policy and education. It did not take long for German Jews to feel the effects of this policy throughout the educational system. One key reason why it's so important to study the history of private Jewish schools in Nazi Germany is that it reminds us that the concrete effects of hate and discrimination don't just appear fully formed overnight. Too often, we overlook the actual process by which the Nazis marginalized, dehumanized, and attacked Jews in German society after 1933. We are also confronted in this case study tonight with another common question about the Jewish experience in Germany after the Nazis took power. Why didn't Germany's Jews not simply leave the country as soon as this persecution began? This is a very complicated question, and its full discussion lies beyond the scope of my talk tonight. However, it does bear directly on the reasoning for creating private Jewish schools and remaining in Germany for as long as many Jewish families actually did. Put simply, many German Jews conceived of themselves as German citizens who happened to be of the Jewish faith. Many were patriotic in their support for Germany and its cultural and scientific accomplishments. Jews volunteered and fought for Germany in World War I in similar numbers as their non-Jewish neighbors. For example, Ernst Goldschmidt, the husband of one of Berlin's private Jewish school founders, fought with distinction in the German army during World War I, earning the Iron Cross. In spite of all the prejudice they and their families had faced, many German Jews were proud to be German. The Nazis irrevocably destroyed that basic relationship. Jews became defined as a different race of people, not to be mixed or integrated with a so-called pure Aryan German society. In this environment, the continued notion of Germans of the Jewish faith became completely untenable. Moreover, the global situation and ridiculous Nazi policies like the so-called national flight tax, which sought to profit off of Jewish families desperately trying to leave Germany, made emigration a very real challenge. While many German Jews were ultimately able to escape, many chose not to or could not get out for various reasons. Therefore, as we consider the question of Jewish private schools in the remainder of this talk, we will see a gradual process unfolding. German Jewish children were not banned from all schools overnight, but that was the ultimate goal. Conversely, many German Jews could not possibly imagine how bad things would actually become. Some hoped that after a brief period of persecution after the Nazi seizure of power, things would calm down. After all, Jews had experienced waves of persecution and pogroms at other times in German and European history. All of these factors informed what we will now discuss: Berlin's private Jewish schools in the Third Reich. With the Nazi seizure of power and the increasing brutalization of Jewish students, many of Berlin's Jewish residents began to take more seriously the idea that they would have to organize their own schools. This was especially difficult for families who did not want to give in to this new discrimination. Some parents encouraged their children to tough it out or stand up for themselves in the initial months of Nazi pressure and growing bullying. However, as it became clear that their Jewish identity made them constant targets, they had to adjust to the new reality. Those Jewish leaders, educators, and families that gradually accustomed themselves to this idea began to think about the future and how schools might best prepare Jewish students for what might come. By 1936, the Central Organization of Jews in Germany had helped to create roughly 160 specifically Jewish schools with over 1,000 teachers nationwide. These schools could not be supported by tax or federal funds of any kind based on new Nazi law. So they relied on funding from the Central Association, parents, local Jewish communities, and donations and voluntary work. There were at least a dozen such schools in Berlin, the city with by far the country's largest Jewish population, including combined lower and middle schools and one designated high school. Ironically, all of these schools still fell under the jurisdiction of the Nazi Ministry of Education and had to be registered with them. Because the Nazi state in this period still hoped to force Jews to leave Germany, they tolerated Jewish-only schools as a preferred option to mixed classrooms in regular public schools. Moreover, these private Jewish schools began to emphasize both preparation for university entrance exams in England, France, and the United States, and also basic skilled trades and rudimentary agricultural skills, which might help them secure work in their countries of refuge. These features of Jewish education seemed to indicate to Nazi authorities that the schools were preparing their students to leave the country. By 1938, the year that the Nazis completely banned all Jews from public schools, and this took place late in the year after Kristallnacht in November of 1938, these institutions, private Jewish schools, were the only remaining option for German Jews who had not yet left the country. For the sake of time this evening, I will highlight the experience of one of the best-known Jewish private schools in Berlin, the so-called private Jewish school Kaliski, founded and operated by Charlotte Kaliski. Because Kaliski emigrated to the United States in 1938, many of the school's records survived the war and were eventually donated to the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. The German Federal Archives in Berlin also contain files pertaining to the school from the perspective of the Nazi bureaucracy. This kind of source material is not, sadly, available for many other private Jewish schools, as some of their records were destroyed or their founders and teachers murdered in the Holocaust. All in all, the Kaliski School story is largely representative of the private school movement as a whole. Charlotte Kaliski was born to a German Jewish family in 1908 in the then Eastern German city of Breslau. She attended top public schools in that city and earned excellent grades. She also suffered from the effects of polio, which observers noted drove her to be as independent and self-reliant as possible. After graduating and earning her teacher's license, she moved to Berlin at the end of 1931 and began applying for teaching positions. This was a difficult process during the Great Depression, as the Prussian state government had cut nearly 1,000 teaching jobs to reduce its budget. Facing one rejection after another, Charlotte Kaliski decided to found her own forest school with private funding. This concept of a forest school, in German it's called a Waldschule, took advantage of the large urban forests in Berlin to create a hybrid school for students to study academics and recover from tuberculosis and other ailments, in part, the theory went, through the power of nature and fresh air. Her school, initially founded in 1932, shortly before the Nazis came to power, was open to students of all backgrounds, at least initially, and religious beliefs, and strove to strengthen the body and mind through classroom study and outdoor activities and chores that also benefited the day-to-day operations of the school itself. Although she could not have predicted it at the time, Charlotte Kaliski had created a model that would serve her future Jewish-only students very well indeed. Charlotte ran the school with a principal named Heinrich Selver, whose own family left the Russian Empire for Germany after anti-Jewish pogroms at the end of the 19th century. Between 1933 and 36, the school switched buildings twice, both times occupying vacant, donated large Jewish-owned estates in the southwest Berlin suburb of Grunewald. These two images here on the screen are from the school's final location. One of them is a drawing of the front of the school from a departing teacher, and the other one is a back view of that same building. So these were very large estates with substantial grounds attached to them that were either donated or purchased or used under lease to serve as schools. Turning a large private mansion and its expansive grounds and gardens into a school for over 300 children, often spending a great deal of time outdoors, posed a real challenge. The Kaliski School's curriculum educated students in many of the traditional academic disciplines that were common in the regular German public school K-12 system. Several important differences existed, however. Number one, for middle and high school students, the school set up intensive programs for English or French language competency and an advanced curriculum so that they could either graduate high school and gain admittance to universities in England, France, or the United States, or leave school before high school graduation and ease their integration into foreign schools if part or all of their family was actually able to get out of Germany. Here are two examples of diplomas or transfer transcripts that demonstrate this kind of work. What you see here, this is in German, so I can translate. This is from a student, Gunther Stench. It gives his name and all of his background information, and as you move down, it tells you what class he was in, and then it says, is leaving the institution in order to attend a school in a foreign country. And you can see here all of the various subjects, religion, Hebrew, German, French, English, Latin, history, geography, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, drawing, music, industrial arts, needlework, and physical exercise, and handwriting. He has the grade there, and you can see the code at the bottom. His handwriting grade is satisfactory, which was something I never achieved in school. So. Here's a really interesting one. When we reflect on what these schools meant to individuals, and I'll talk about this in a minute, what it actually meant, not just to talk about huge numbers, but to talk about individual people and the impact that this had on them and their education. A great example of this is this man, Peter Landsberg. So Peter Landsberg went on, once he got out of Germany in 1938, his father died when he was quite young. He went on to earn a PhD and became a prominent theoretical physicist. He was born in 1922 and he died only fairly recently in 2010. And here, in English, is his report card / transcript that fits, if you can read the language at the upper right, Senior English, Cambridge School Certificate, and it gives you the semester and the date, and up in the left you see the private forest school, Kaliski, Berlin, Dahlem. And what's very interesting is, first of all, the entire transcript or report card is completely in English, so the goal in this case was that he would leave eventually for Great Britain, which he was able to do in what was called the Kindertransport, and I'll talk about that in a minute. He was able to get out. He was separated from his mother, who also got out, ended up in Argentina, and they didn't see each other again for 15 years after their separation, and his father had already died. So as a teenager, he ended up in Great Britain, and what's quite interesting about this is if you look under general science, about 2/3 of the way down on the card, the first subcategory of general science is physics. And in English it says, shows keen interest. And that turned out to be quite true. So here is an example of an individual life, someone who went through the Kaliski school like these other private Jewish schools, and not only survived, not only was not murdered in the Holocaust, but survived and went on to contribute in unimaginable ways, in this case, to the field of theoretical physics. And I think in some ways, seeing his picture, this is from a pretty lengthy obituary from one of the British newspapers, I can't remember, that talked about all of the work he had done and his contributions. So it was really interesting for me to come across this in English, to see somebody's report card at a private Jewish school in Berlin, and then see what happened with his life after. And I think that connection is very powerful testimony to what these schools were able to do. For all students, some of whom had already been subjected to terrible treatment in regular German public schools in their first years, these private Jewish schools sought to build up and support their Jewish identity specifically. In addition to training in modern Hebrew, something that did not exist in mixed German public schools, students of all ages participated in religious and cultural events at school. Here is a picture of a Hanukkah festival from the Kaliski School from 1936. And I think it's quite a powerful picture. In addition, these private Jewish schools formed their own inter-school athletic competition, which took place on a regular basis at Berlin's Jewish Community Sports Complex, Also in the same Grunewald neighborhood as most of these private schools. It was a really sizable complex, and these were held on a fairly regular basis, the competition between these schools. This picture is not the best quality, but what's interesting, if you look, well, sort of right here in the foreground with this sign coming up, I don't know how clear that is out there. It says private forest school, Private Waldschule Kolinsky. So this is actually a picture of the athletes that attended that school and then competed on behalf of that school in this Jewish School Sport Festival in 1936. Here's another picture, not of the Kolinsky school, but of two other schools, the Josef Lehmann school in front, and then the sign in the back is the Jewish private school Goldschmidt, which was run by Leonore Goldschmidt. And so you also get a sense, I think, in this picture of the pretty substantial crowds that showed up for these inter-school athletic competitions. Finally, in addition to academic and cultural work, students were encouraged to learn what might be called life skills, including basic woodworking, planting, tending, harvesting gardens, and doing basic chores for the school. Part of this came from Kolinsky's own pedagogical background, that students should experience outdoor work as much as possible and also do their share for the day-to-day operation of the school. However, there was also a growing belief that these types of skills might become useful for some students to gain an apprenticeship or work in their adopted lands. What I'd like to do now, and I hope the technology allows me to do this. So here is students of various ages engaged in garden work at the Kolinsky School. Again, this is a picture from 1938. And this was all built into the daily curriculum. Here is an industrial arts class. And peeling potatoes. The potatoes that they were going to eat that day or in the near future. And again, here you get a sense of the age range. One of the things about these private schools is that in some cases they accommodated kind of the equivalent of what we would think of as almost K through 8. And in the German system, that compressed a lot of the other what were called upper schools. So you had a lot of different age groups of children together. And in the video that I'm going to show you, it's very brief, only about 3 minutes. You get a real sense of all the different ages of children who attended these schools. So what I'd like to do now is to show you what I think is a really remarkable about 3-minute video. There's no sound, and it is not from the Kolinsky school itself. It is from the Goldschmidt school, which was very near, less than a mile away from the Kolinsky school in this same suburb of Grunewald. And U.S. American journalist, his name was Julian Bryan, if any of you have ever heard of him. He toured Europe quite a bit in the 1930s, and he came back. He went to the Soviet Union, he went to Austria, Germany, other countries, and he would log sort of travel narratives to describe both through video, through pictures, through a range of other reporting, either on the radio or videos that could be shown before movies at that time. And the video you're going to see here came from his personal collection. It has a very long and circuitous history that I won't go through today, but it ended up, as you'll see here, recorded, and it's been digitally improved as much as possible in the holdings of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And what you'll see here is it's about 3 minutes, as I said, without sound. you will see the actual day-to-day life of students in the Goldschmidt School. And in a lot of ways, the film shows a range of ages for the students while they're out on recess. It shows classroom activity, and at the very end, there's about a couple of seconds at the end where you can see they're cutting to the industrial arts class, but that gets cut off at the end. But I think this again is another very powerful reminder of the individuals that attended these schools and what it meant to them to be able to learn and continue to live something approaching a normal life in a system that despised them and hated them and treated them terribly in the other schools from which many of them had come. So we'll watch this, and then I have some concluding thoughts. Oh. And this is the last building for the Goldschmidt School as well, in a private estate. And there's the industrial arts class at the end. As Kaliski and the principal, Heinrich Selver, struggled to run this oasis and keep their students studying and working, they also faced constant harassment and threats to reduce the school size or close it outright. The Nazi education ministry holdings in the German Federal Archives in Berlin, and they're quite extensive, contain detailed records of the Kaliski School's struggles with local neighbors and city and national authorities. These documents reveal complaints from anti-Semitic neighbors about quote-unquote noise and smells coming from the derogatorily named Jew school in the neighborhood. And that language, unfortunately, as painful as that is used intentionally in these reports, because in German you can refer to the school as a Jewish school, but calling it a Jew school was done intentionally to be defamatory. Hiding behind questionable interpretations of zoning laws, these neighbors combined with a handful of zealous Nazi party officials to try and close the Kaliski school on a number of occasions. Not surprisingly, many of these Nazi party members eyed these large estates in the Grunewald suburb for their own use, as Jewish families were increasingly losing their businesses and homes to Nazi expropriation measures beginning in the late 1930s. Remarkably, Charlotta Kaliski and the principal, Heinrich Selver, successfully appealed to the National Ministry of Education to keep the school running. Their argument? Acting in accordance with National Socialist educational policy, they recognized the desire for a strict separation of Aryan and Jewish students. Berlin's public schools had already largely been purged of Jews, so these students needed somewhere to study. Remarkably, this argument held until the calamitous events of late 1938 and 1939. By March 1939, the situation in Germany had changed substantially. In November 1938, the Nazis launched the infamous Kristallnacht pogrom, murdering over 100 Jews, deporting thousands more to concentration camps, and destroying Jewish businesses, homes, synagogues, and other property. In the wake of this brutality, Nazi leaders also took more aggressive action against those Jews who still remained in Germany. This was true for Berlin's private Jewish schools as well. While such institutions were still technically allowed to exist until June of 1942, when they were completely banned, the Nazis effectively shut down many private schools by expropriating and selling off the buildings and the land in which they were located. Such was the case for the Kaliski School. In March 1939, the school in Grunewald was confiscated by the Nazi state and sold for a pittance to the German Foreign Office. Only weeks before, Charlotta Kaliski and Heinrich Selver had managed to emigrate to the United States. Paul Jacob, seen here, one of the beloved teachers of this school for those students who got out and recalled their time there, also the last school administrator, emigrated to Palestine shortly after the school was closed, only months before the outbreak of war in Europe. The Kaliski School's experience shows the gradual and uneven development of Nazi policy toward German Jews in the years before 1939. The regime's primary goal in this period was to segregate Jews from the rest of German society and put increasing pressure on them to leave the country. Many Jews, over time, finally reached this conclusion, with about 40% of German Jews remaining in the country when Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. Once the war broke out in Europe, most options for remaining Jews in Germany to leave were closed down. With the violence of Kristallnacht as a crucial turning point, the regime moved from discrimination, segregation, and forced immigration to violence, deportation, and ultimately mass murder. By 1943, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels crowed that Berlin, the capital of the Thousand-Year Reich, was finally judenfrei, or free of Jews. Like nearly all of Goebbels' bombastic pronouncements, this was also a lie, as several thousand Berlin Jews had gone into hiding. But Goebbels' fanatical public declaration does show how far things had evolved from the early days of 1933. And while Charlotta Kaliski, Leonore Goldschmidt, and several other school founders were able to get out before the deportations and mass killing began, others were not so lucky. Anna Peltison, another school founder, was deported from Berlin in 1943 and died at 75 years old in Theresienstadt. In that same year, another school founder, Helene Herrmann, along with her husband and sister, was deported from Berlin and would ultimately be murdered at Auschwitz a year later in 1944. A good number of students did escape, overwhelmingly before September 1939, with at least some of their family members to various locations abroad. However, some children, usually aged 16 or under, also survived by being sent to Great Britain on what was called the Children's Transport, or in German, Kindertransport program. The Kindertransport system arranged for German and Austrian Jewish children to travel to Britain and stay with host families, but did not allow their parents to accompany them. While this program saved at least 10,000 young people, there are many stories about the excruciating goodbyes as parents put their children on board a train or ship to send them off into the unknown. The vast majority of these Kindertransport children would never see their parents or most of their extended family members again. Finally, we know that by 1942, roughly 25,000 of an original 85,000 school-age children and young people under 18 years old remained in the pre-war borders of Germany. Of those, roughly 20,000 were ultimately murdered in the Holocaust. While we do not have comprehensive records of all of the students who attended each of Berlin's private Jewish schools in the 1930s, it is certain that the vast majority of those who could not emigrate or hide themselves after the outbreak of war in 1939 ultimately died in the Nazi final solution. In a final tragic turn, many of those children would have left Berlin for the death camps of the East, from the city's main designated deportation terminal, Track 17 at Berlin's Grunewald train station. And you can see here the long distance, the Fernbahn track has been shut down and has been turned into a memorial. And as best as they can do, they've documented every deportation. Roughly 50,000 of Berlin's Jewish residents were deported from Berlin-Grunewald, and they've put over 160 iron plaques that designate the dates and the number of Jews that were deported from this particular train station. The irony of this and the location of this station is the fact that in most cases, the Berlin-Grunewald train station was less than a mile away from the very private schools in the same Grunewald neighborhood that kept these young people learning and alive for the first years of the Nazi terror. Now, a few final thoughts. Among the nearly incomprehensible facts about the Holocaust is the scholarly consensus that at least 1.5 million children under the age of 14 were murdered by the Nazis in Germany and throughout occupied Europe. While we do not know the exact numbers, some of those Berlin students that we just saw in those pictures in the brief video were among the victims. It is sometimes overwhelming to contemplate the sheer scale of this mass killing. In discussing total numbers, we overlook the faces and lives of the individuals who died. We must always remember that these were each unique individuals with hopes and dreams and life goals. They are certainly not just numbers on a page. This terrible statistic also points to the massive scope of the Shoah, driven by Hitler's plan to cleanse not just Germany, but all of Europe and eventually the world of Jews. While tonight's talk highlighted the gradual and uneven development of Nazi policy regarding Jewish education in Germany itself, such a process did not exist in other countries conquered and occupied by the Nazi war machine. As a result, what happened in Germany over the course of a decade for that country's Jews became a stark reality for practically all Jewish residents in occupied countries like Poland, often in a matter of mere months. Of Poland's pre-war Jewish population of about 3.3 million, Europe's largest at the time, fewer than 300,000 remained at the war's end. The overwhelming majority of Jews living in Nazi-occupied countries were either shot in large groups or rounded up into makeshift ghettos and eventually deported to several killing centers where they were worked to death, died of starvation or disease, or gassed in huge numbers. That is the sobering reminder of the larger context of tonight's presentation. It is my genuine hope that this talk has helped to illuminate an important chapter not only in the German Jewish experience, but also the larger context of the Holocaust. Indeed, this history of private Jewish schools in Nazi Berlin helps us understand several important lessons about the anti-Semitic persecution of the Nazi regime. First of all, it is important to view the unfolding of the Holocaust in Germany as a gradual process and appreciate the fact that even smaller, seemingly less important measures in the early years of the Nazi regime laid the groundwork for more extreme and violent measures later on. What this historical episode teaches us is that all of these individual measures ultimately contributed in important ways to the final decision for deportation and mass murder. The fact that these private Jewish schools in Berlin operated as long as they did and helped as many students as they did is a testament both to the faculty, students, and families themselves, but also an important example of how Nazi anti-Jewish policy in Germany developed unevenly over time. Secondly, this story bears witness to the durability of Jewish identity in the very heart of the Nazi state and helps us better understand the incredibly difficult position that faced German Jews in this period. We've already addressed briefly the painful question of leaving or staying in Germany. Also important to understand, however, is how many German Jews began to comprehend and address the intensifying persecution against them, adapting their school lessons and curriculum to reflect the looming prospect of forced immigration. It serves as an example of a people who did not simply give in to Nazi pressure, but rather sought to do everything within their power to train and educate the future generation in subjects and life skills that would not only help them better understand the difficult world around them, but also actually, in some cases, save their lives. This is a remarkable accomplishment in an unthinkably difficult set of circumstances. Lastly, this story helps us better understand the power of history to shed light on more universal problems that still plague us in the present day. Tolerating or turning a blind eye to hatred and anti-Semitism is a recipe for disaster, as we can clearly see from this historical example. Through propaganda, the Nazis sought to gradually desensitize a population already strongly susceptible to anti-Semitic prejudice and stereotypes, and convince the vast majority of Germans that their fellow German Jewish citizens no longer mattered as human beings. As many Holocaust scholars have observed, the key to carrying out the most extreme, murderous forms of the so-called final solution was not always passionate, burning hatred from every single non-Jewish German. Rather, it was reinforcing a broad sense of intolerance, indifference, and disdain for Jews and other victims, which allowed the regime and its fanatical executioners to target and murder Jews with minimal interference and indeed sometimes enthusiastic civilian support, simply because they were Jews. So, let us take this opportunity tonight to remember the inspiring actions of these Jewish teachers, students, and families and try to learn something from their stories. This allows us both to value and honor the actions of individuals in the face of intolerance and persecution, but also reminds us what it really means when we use phrases like never forget or never again. These words should mean both commemorating and learning from the past, but also using history to be constantly vigilant about our present and future. We owe it to these Jewish students, teachers, and families to do nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackisch. That was a very powerful talk. I really appreciate it. We have a hard stop at 7:15, but that does leave us about 10 minutes for questions for Dr. Jackisch, if you have any. We'd be happy to take them. Yes, please.
Professor, what were the major archives that you used to put this together?
So there are a number of things from. The question was, what were the major archives or collections that I used to put this together? And this is actually a good way of referring to, these are 4 books. If you're interested specifically on the experience of Jews in Berlin, there is some good work on this. A lot of the source material that I used is only available in German and hasn't been translated into English. So that's the first answer to your question. The part of that are so if you could actually go to the Leo Baeck Institute online and see some of the scanned documents from the Kaliski School. A few of them are in English. For example, there's a prospectus, a school prospectus that's there that's in English. But for the most part, most of them are in German. But it's a real hit or miss proposition because some of these school records were destroyed. Some of the people, as I mentioned, who started these schools were never able to get out and ultimately ended up dying. So in the case of the Goldschmidt School or the Kaliski School, there are some records that they brought with them when they left to a limited extent. What is even more, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but the Reich or the Nazi Ministry of Education records are still completely available in the Federal Archive, the German Federal Archives in Berlin. And there is a massive file in there on the Kaliski School in particular that documents in meticulous fashion these neighbors' complaints that I mentioned, all of the really very ugly, derogatory comments, but also chronicles, I think, and I only touched on a little bit of that for the sake of time tonight, touches on the really dogged persistence that Kaliski and Heinrich Selver showed in going back, in some cases at really, in many ways, personal risk to their own lives, to keep going back and making the argument. I mean, their petitions and their letters are also in there, where they say, look, you've closed off all other options in the German public school system for these students. We're doing a service here, and they're constantly going back and forth trying to get them, and it worked. It worked for a number of years. They kept this going. And the real breaking point comes, as I said, then later in 1938 with Kristallnacht, and all of those policies become much more severe. For example, the Nazis completely ban all remaining Jews that were still in German public schools. They accelerate substantially the expropriation of Jewish property, so they start in a much more aggressive fashion to basically confiscate and take Jewish businesses, homes, and other things. And because, for example, the Kaliski School was donated by a woman who had emigrated but still owned the property. She had emigrated to England earlier. They basically invented part of this expropriation law that said, if you leave, it's ours, right? And so they were able to purchase that home basically for nothing. For all intents and purposes, they stole it. So, yeah.
But Dr. Jackisch, I'm
Yeah.
going to have you be right in front of the mic
Yep.
so that the
Oh,
streaming,
that's
the
right.
people online
I forgot.
can hear you. And
Yep.
if you would indeed repeat that question, that would help the people online here. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, of course.
Why do you think that allowing these schools to exist was part of the deception of their ultimate plans hatched at the Wannsee Conference? In other words, was this part of the deception when ultimately they knew that they were going to kill everybody anyway?
I think that is a.
Repeat the question.
Oh, right. Repeat the question. So the question was, basically, were these schools not part of the larger deception that the Nazi state put into effect to sort of reassure Jews for a certain period of time that nothing was going to happen, with the intent later on that you knew the grand design was ultimately the final solution and mass murder? That was the question. I think it depends on what country you're talking about. One of the interesting things about Germany in particular is there were a range of views specifically about how to deal. So there was this widespread belief within the elite and the leadership of the Nazi Party that there was a so-called Jewish problem. Most Nazi leaders agreed with the premise that Jews could not be Germans, that in this new system, those were completely incompatible, in effect, races of people. The problem is, and the bigger question becomes, and I talk about this in my classes, this is a great example of the absolute, of many things, but of the absolute stupidity of racism. Because if you look at the way that the Nazis passed a whole raft of legislation early on, starting in April of 1933, they're banning Jewish doctors from working with non-Jewish patients, attorneys, the press, teachers, students, you name it. There's a whole raft of that type of legislation. What ends up happening is that party headquarters and various government agencies like the Ministry of Education start getting flooded with letters from Germans who say, "Am I Jewish? My grandparents were both Jewish, but I was actually baptized and took First Communion and was raised as a Catholic. So am I subject to these laws?" And so what they ended up doing is it's putting the racist cart before the horse in a way. And so they go back in the early fall of 1935 and write what many of you probably know, what come to be called the Nuremberg laws, which were actually called the laws for the protection of blood and honor. And so in that way, they then start to legally document who is Jewish and who is not. And so I think, in answer to your question, this is a much more drawn-out process in Germany than it is, for example, in Poland or in the Baltic countries, for example, or in other parts of Europe where German military forces move in, overrun the country, take direct control of the country, and aren't terribly concerned about the laws or the legality of what they're doing. They begin deportations right away. There is more concern within Germany about German Jews and their network of perhaps non-Jewish friends and acquaintances and others if you just immediately acted on them to remove them. There were absolutely fanatics in the Nazi Party who would have preferred to carry out the final solution right away, as soon as possible. There were others, interestingly enough, one of the lawyers who was responsible for drafting major parts of the Nuremberg laws actually believed, and I know this is a crazy thought, but he and others argued, we are not just doing a fly-by-night operation here. We are crafting a 1,000-year Reich that long after we're dead, scholars, legal experts, and others will want to go back into the records, and they will want to see the legal basis on which we, according to the law, removed Jews from our society permanently. And so in that regard, you have a variety of different opinions. He also, you mentioned the Wannsee Conference that takes place in January of 1942 outside of Berlin. He also, interestingly, is one of the attendees of that conference. So I think the short answer to your question is the process is more drawn out in Germany because of where the Nazis come from and their place within that country, but it is nowhere near that long and drawn out in other countries that the Nazis invade, like Poland and elsewhere. When they move in militarily, they basically do what they want.
We have time for one more question, and I also wanted to mention that Dr. Jackisch has business cards, so he would be very happy to answer questions, by email or to chat with you afterwards if you still have questions. Oh, sorry. Yes.
It's more of a comment because we don't have time to get into this, but I really do hope that you have the microphone, so to speak, on campus today to even beyond the scope of maybe the students that are in your classes to be able to educate college students about the similarities between the late 20s and into the 30s and some of the things that Jewish students are experiencing on campuses, on this campus. And so beyond the scope of 715, but I do hope and I support you and we support you in whatever you need to be able to extend this lesson and message to way beyond your classrooms.
Well, I appreciate that sentiment, and I tell anyone that will listen to me, I love my job. I have a great job. I get to work with a lot of really great students, some of whom are in the audience tonight. I mean, what are the odds that you actually get some of your students to turn out? I appreciated it, 6 o'clock in the evening. I will say, to your comment, one of the things, sometimes I talk to people and I say, the question comes up, well, what do you do for a living? Okay. I say, well, I'm a history professor. And almost always, I get one of two answers. Somebody will say, oh God, I hated history, it was terrible. That's okay, no problem. I'll get a variation of that, which is, I hated history when I was younger, but now I actually see the value of it and I like history. Or I'll have somebody, ask me and say, wow, what do you teach? And they're really interested in it. And so it borders on being sort of corny or cliched for me to say that I believe very much that we can learn from the past. This is not sort of a simplistic thing where we say, well, this is a directly analogous situation. This happened here, and it's exactly like this over here. I'm not making that argument. But I do believe, and that's one of the things that I think that 3-minute film that I showed you, or the pictures of those students, we get drawn into an argument about the scale of numbers. And we forget about individuals, and that each one of them had particular hopes and dreams, like Peter Landsberg, who ends up in Great Britain and becomes a really brilliant theoretical physicist. And so one of the things that I absolutely do in all of my classes, and I teach on a regular basis a history of the Holocaust class at University of Toledo. I also teach other classes, a film and World War II class, also Russian history, which I've done quite a few public talks recently about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So these are all topics that are tremendously important to me. I also believe, for many different reasons, not just because I love my job, but also because these are very valuable lessons to remember about dehumanization. And that is something that I emphasize in all of my classes. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.